people's champion. Our mission is love, our vision is love. Jamaicans, for justice, the people's champion, champion. Justice, justice for all. Justice under the law. Justice, Jamaica demand. Right to life, right to liberty. Justice, justice for all. Justice under the law. Justice, the people demand. Right to life and security. Oh, what a joy. Oh, what a peace. How great this country could be. Respecting your rights, respecting human rights. What a wonderful nation this could be. Out of many we are one in a Jamaica.
Welcome to another episode of Let's Start Justice. We are joined via Zoom and we're doing a little bit of a pre-recording this week, but we're still happy to be here. We're going to be discussing some important topics as usual, focusing primarily on child rights issues. Now, for those who are not aware, we celebrate the rights of our children in society in May. And for the course of this month, we're going to be focusing on some particular topics, issues that affect children, how happy they're being in society, how well their needs are being catered to. And we're going to be joined by Professor Anthony Clayton in short order. My name is Michael Jackson, Executive Director of Jamaicans for Justice.
And I'm Jade Williams, the Policy and Advocacy Specialist at Jamaicans for Justice.
And I realize, Prof, you're online with us. Welcome.
Thank you. Good morning, Michael. Good morning, Jade. How are you?
Good morning. I'm doing well.
Thank
Excellent.
you. All right, a little bit of a housekeeping before we get into the program, though. Normally we start off with the week that was, explaining some of the human rights issues that arose in the news cycle, things that we believe the public ought to be aware of. We're going to be taking that towards the end of the program, or the second half of the program. So Jade, I will turn over to you to deal with, the niceties of giving away credit and so on with your brain teasers, if you will.
Okay, thank you so much. So I'll do that as quickly as I can. We have, first of all, our right of the day today, which is related, I think, to the topic. We talk about our right for freedom from torture, inhumane and degrading punishment, or other treatment. And that is section 13(6) of our Constitution here in Jamaica. So that means that no person shall be subjected to any action that could be considered torture, any action that could be considered inhumane or degrading to that person by any other person in this society. And we also have for this week our trivia question, which is how long, essentially, can the Children's Advocate hold office? So at what age does the Children's Advocate have to leave office? And if you look in your Child Care and Protection Act, you'll find it somewhere in there. So we'll respond to the trivia question. It will be posted on our social media as normal, and we will respond through our social media DM as normal.
Alrighty. So the giveaway is tomorrow, even though we're doing the pre-recording today on a Monday. So we'll try to remind ourselves that we're going a little bit ahead of time for our listeners as we speak. So today is actually Monday, not Tuesday, as I said. Happy Tuesday earlier. But thanks again. So the meat of the matter, some serious conversations now. We're going to be discussing child rights and corporal punishment. And I think because we do have an expert on the call, Professor Anthony Clayton, crime and national security expert. Prof, if you would allow us, we may broaden the scope of the conversation just a tad to focus more broadly on child abuse in society and some of the other community factors that may very well be affecting our children and their predisposition to violence, if you will, as we have the conversation. No, I think if we look at the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child that is responsible for overseeing the conventions of the rights of the child, they define corporal or physical punishment as any form of punishment utilizing physical force with the intention of causing even minimal pain or discomfort. Now, there are advocates like Jamaicans for Justice, Jayan, UNICEF, who have consistently advocated for the prohibition of corporal punishment, and we have vocalized our support here at JFJ to the 2017 amendment to the Education Act that will see the banning of corporal punishment in all school settings.
What we have realized as well is that the research has consistently shown that there is a correlation between childhood exposure to corporal punishment and later engagement in criminal behavior. And some studies have indicated that children who experience corporal punishment are more likely to exhibit aggressive tendencies later in life, antisocial behavior, and have an increased risk of involvement in those kinds of criminal activities. So we supported the proposal in hopes to see a breaking of the cycle, so to speak.
All right, and this recommendation, again, it has been broadened by the National Violence Commission that is saying that let's not just focus on banning it in school setting, let's focus on banning corporal punishment in all settings, in the family settings and so on. And it's something that we can all get behind, but others are saying that let's take some caution here. Let's ensure that we're training the parents. Let's ensure that we're dealing with this thing in a phased basis to perhaps change some of those sociocultural norms that we have in Jamaica. But Professor Clayton, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate you being here. From your standpoint, you've seen, the toughened crime measures being proposed by the government. You've heard some of those statements from the public that let's imprison our children for years to come when they commit certain offenses. Just immediate, what is your response to some of the calls that you've been hearing in the public space?
Mikhail, there's actually very little evidence that being extremely tough on crime actually does much to reduce the level of crime. What does do a lot to reduce the level of crime is to increase the probability of detection and capture. So if you had the choice, if you arrest somebody for a homicide, if you're going to send them to jail for 20 years or 30 years, that doesn't really make very much difference on the level of homicide in society. But if you can get the arrest and conviction rate up from under 5% to 60%, which they actually achieved in Colombia a few years ago, that's a major deterrent on the level of violence in society. So it's really much more to do with people realizing that they are much more likely to actually be caught and be sentenced for the crime. The severity of the crime has surprisingly little difference on the outcome. Now, obviously, what I'm talking about here are statistical outcomes. Individuals do vary quite a lot, and people's reasons for committing acts of violence vary as well. So this is not going to apply in absolutely every single individual case. But for a population as a whole, there isn't much doubt that if we improved our ability to do forensics, to have more detectives, to increase the probability of being arrested for an act of violence and swiftly sentenced and actually do the time in jail, that would have the biggest deterrent effect on the overall level of violent crime in society.
Yes,
to be honest, I think that when people talk about increasing the severity of the punishment, this isn't actually based on an understanding of what we already know about crime. It's more a kind of a reaction to the fact that we're also weary of living in a society with a high level of violence. And that takes a toll. It takes an emotional toll, and people just want this problem to go away and be done. And of course, naturally, what they think of is just lock them up forever. Unfortunately, people's perception of a situation is not necessarily the same as the reality. And the reality is that we actually need to improve our ability to make sure we've arrested the right person, and that punishment and appropriate punishment will be carried out And if we could increase that probability, we would do quite a lot to reduce the level of violence in society.
Thank you for that. We've seen an increased focus in the discussion around crime prevention on children in particular. And the challenge that we've had is that we have observed from our work at JFJ where a child might enter a life of criminality due to their traumatic background. So, to what extent should we be taking that into account as we are looking for ways to address juvenile delinquency and particularly violent children?
Right. Jade, a few years ago, I did a policy review for the Department of Correctional Services. And this involved going into most of our penitentiaries, and I also went into the juvenile facilities. And I met children who were very clearly there because they had been traumatized. One or two harrowing cases where the child had been repeatedly sexually abused and had been psychologically destroyed. Now, we used to, and I think we're starting to move away from this concept now, but we used to put children in jail for what was called uncontrollable behavior. And in many of these cases, what we were actually looking at was children with post-traumatic stress disorder, and they should not have been in jail at all. In fact, in some cases that I came across, it was the people who did that to the children who should have been in jail, but they were not. It was the child that was in jail. And I could not help but feel that that was the most horrifying failure of our humanity, let alone our system of justice. You see, the problem is, please understand that when I'm talking about abuse, I'm not talking about giving a toddler, a small smack on the bottom when they do something that they're not supposed to do. I'm talking about a child being beaten, severely beaten, repeatedly. A child in a situation where there is no escape for them from trauma. They're beaten, they're physically, psychologically, sexually abused, or they're traumatized by seeing other family members beaten, like, for example, their mother, or they've seen family members killed. Now, in such cases, the child's brain can be irrevocably affected because the child is extremely stressed. And stress makes our brain trigger the release of two hormones in particular, cortisol and adrenaline. And when a child is exposed to toxic long-term stress, the hormonal regulatory system becomes permanently sensitized. What this means is that your body cannot stop producing cortisol. And what that then does to your brain is you get changes, you get inflammatory response, you get reduced immunity, you get changes in brain structure, and possibly even changes in epigenetic expression. The child who is exposed to long-term toxic stress, the brain tends to be smaller, and the child has lifelong problems in learning, in behavior, and in physical and mental health. The child is left with a permanently reduced ability to regulate its thinking, manage its emotions, or control its behavior. And it's likely to end up with either post-traumatic stress disorder or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or both. And children with either of these or both of these have a lot of trouble concentrating. They have difficulty learning. They are easily distracted. They don't listen well. They interrupt people. They tend to be disorganized and restless and have antisocial behavior. They're quite often aggressive and self-destructive. In fact, they're often very anxious, feel scared and helpless, and have low self-esteem. Unfortunately, it's these symptoms that get the children into more trouble, both at school and at home, which adds to their
We have to
stress and
take the
makes their
break.
symptoms worse.
Prof, we have to take the break 1 second to deal with some matters here.
Sure, sure.
On the other side, we will pick up and you just explain to us as you're going through how we respond to some of these issues as you finish that thought.
Yeah.
The people's champion. The people's champion. Our mission is love. Our vision is love. Jamaicans, for justice. The people's champion.
Hi, welcome back to Let's Talk Justice. We're dealing with the issue of child rights, corporal punishment, but just generally how child abuse may make children more predisposed to violence and how we can adjust and address some of these issues. We're here with Professor Clayton, and he was just explaining to us some of the effects that child abuse would have on the children and how they react to different situations. So if you could just finish the thought, Prof, and then
Sure.
we can have a discussion about whether or not we have enough adolescent psychologists, mental health experts in that area.
Right. Well, let me just finish the thought by talking briefly about the consequences. We really pick this up in the prison population. We don't have the numbers for Jamaica, but we do have the numbers from other countries, which have found that about 50% of the prison population have got attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Now, this is compared to just 3 to 5% in the general adult population. So a child with ADHD is roughly 10 times more likely to end up in jail. And there's one study, this one was from Denmark, found that nearly half the children with ADHD, in many cases a response to having been traumatized as children, nearly half of them had criminal convictions by the time they were adults. Now, what this means is that child abuse of various different forms, and I mean beating a child, sexually abusing a child, emotional abuse for a child, all of that can, if it goes on, if it's too bad and it's too severe and it goes on for too long, especially before the age, young age, because once a child has gone past the age of 5, there's less and less chance of being able to do any kind of remedial work. That these children are much more likely to underperform at school because they cannot concentrate. They're much more likely to get beaten again because their behavior has become more aberrant and more aggressive for reasons which they cannot control. They're much more likely, therefore, to end up in gangs as a kind of a family substitute, and they're much more likely to end up in criminal activity and in jail. So this is, we haven't yet quantified it. We're hoping to do some research on exactly this subject to kind of get a better idea of the numbers. But my guess is that that beating of children and other forms of abuse of children is actually one of the main predisposing factors in this country to people ending up in lives of crime, ending up in jail. And when you see a young child, often from a broken home, in many cases without a stable male role model, and most of these are young males, their chances of doing well at school and going on to have a decent life are greatly reduced.
Mhm.
So I think that this is probably one of the main contributing factors to the problems that we have in this country today.
Yeah. And the crime you're talking about here, just for clarity, because I wouldn't want the listeners to think we're talking only about the extreme murder as the offense, but we're talking about domestic violence as well, where some of the children who are victims of their
Yes,
childhood would end up being the perpetrators,
yes.
and so on.
I think there are actually connections between the two, Mikhail, because roughly 70% of our homicides are classed as gang-related, 30% classed as domestic. But there's quite a lot of overlap between these categories, as you know. A lot of the gang affiliations overlap with familial relationships. And it's quite often where you've got a pattern of very dysfunctional families that you have this process of high levels of gang recruitment, but you also have this cycle of violence that goes down the generations, because a lot of the people who are child abusers turn out to have been abused as children themselves when they were younger. And a lot of the people who get involved in acts of domestic violence as perpetrators often were witnesses or victims themselves in their turn. This is not 100% true in every case, and it doesn't excuse what anybody does. We all have to take responsibility for our own lives and our own actions. But you can see how, excuse me, there are risk factors that make it much more likely that people will be involved in these activities in future.
You know, I have to consider I don't want to say devil's advocate, but the devil's advocate argument, that, we're talking about the likelihood of the perpetuation of traumatic situations, that it likely would continue to be generational, that the ability to necessarily intervene and rehabilitate reduces as the child gets older. And then we're balancing this with a response that says, okay, so these children are too far gone. We need to just lock them up and take them away from the society for a bit. And that would be the most expeditious way to deal with this serious crime issue.
Yeah.
And I mean, as an advocate, I theoretically know that we would need to be looking more at our core issues or social services. How are we going to respond to these driving factors? But how do you argue with the opposition that says, just locking up these kids is a solution, because at the end of the day, to rehabilitate them is going to take too much, or it might be impossible in some of these cases?
Yeah, I don't see that as opposition. I understand why people would feel that. I really do. And if somebody hurts you or your family, you understandably feel that you just want all of these people locked up. But if we are talking about how do we fix this as a society, then we have to actually be a little bit more analytical and a little bit less emotional. And we have to look at the numbers, see what they're telling us. We have to look at examples elsewhere. Other countries have tried different strategies and see what has worked and what doesn't work. Figure out what would work in this context. If we actually really want to do something fundamental about trying to bring down the level of violence in this society, this is a problem which, unless you're willing to consider really draconian measures, as they've done in El Salvador, then it's going to take a generation, because you have to break the cycle of repeated trauma and abuse. And you have to have things like early intervention strategy. You have to have people based in schools who are trained, who can identify the signs that a child has been abused or traumatized. We have to have the legal mechanism, in some cases, to remove that child from their family and put them into a place of safety. But when I talk about place of safety, I do not advocate adding more children to the orphanages and places of safety that we have now, because some of them are doing, reason as best they can. Others, unfortunately, we've heard some horror stories because child abusers also gravitate to where the children are, vulnerable children.
Yeah.
So I would not advocate for that. Probably the best available solution, and you have to remember now that here we're talking about not choosing between good and bad alternatives, but trying to choose the lesser of the available evils. But the best possible solution is probably to take that child and put it and have a stable, loving family, foster that child so that it's brought up seeing that people are good and behave decently and with kindness. And if you can just give a child that experience in its formative years, then that child is much less likely to end up in a life of crime thereafter. This is not necessarily a quick fix, you understand. It's not an easy option. The alternative is we go the El Salvador road and just lock up every suspected gang member.
Yeah.
And of course, then what they got was a dramatic decline in the level of violence in society, from one of the highest in the world to one of the lowest in Latin America and the Caribbean. Now, there's a price you pay for that. There is no such thing as a perfect solution. It's only a question of which trade-off you're willing to make. The trade-off in that case is that there are some innocent people who went to jail. The counter-argument to that is, yes, but most of the bad people are now in jail. And if we let all of them out, well, what about the human rights of the people that they subsequently go on to murder? One of the first things you learn when you really start to go into these issues is that A, there's no easy answers, and B, there's no such thing as a wonderful solution. You're always trying to choose the best available solution, but there's always going to be trade-offs. My personal preference would be to look for ways that we can rescue more of the children in this society that are in highly stressful situations, where there's not really much hope of being able to straighten out the family with counseling or whatever. And you really just need to get that child out of that situation to save their life. And by so doing, a little further down the road, we will start to see gang recruitment starting to drop and the prison population starting to decline as well.
We have a child diversion program that started in 2020, and it has mostly been utilized based on the data that we've seen from it for less serious offenses. And when it is used for serious offenses, they're usually sexual offenses like rape.
Mm.
Do you think there is value in extending or in courts, because technically our judges can give child diversion for more serious offenses based on the provision in the act. They just don't do it, right? So do you think there is value in them utilizing that power to divert children from offenses like murder or like firearm offenses? Is that helpful in your opinion?
Well, the problem is, Jade, that like we were saying earlier, that once a child is past the age of round about 5, the chances of being able to really achieve what you could with a younger child start to diminish.
Mhm.
And so by the time you get somebody who's still technically a child, but is maybe aged 11 or so, and is pulled a trigger and killed somebody, the chances of being able to restore that child to a decent life are not great. It doesn't mean you shouldn't try, but you have to understand that we're dealing with very limited resources here. And you can say, well, for a given amount of resource, for a given quantum of resource, if I put that into the pre-5 program, I'm actually going to save more lives that way than trying to save every child who's like early teens and has done something heinous, because the success rate tends to be much lower at that point.
Thank you so much, Prof. Please stay with us for a few more minutes. We have to take another break, but I want us to pick up on some of the proposals and ideas that you shared earlier, the interventions with adoption, foster families, and so on. Well, let's take the break, and then we continue.
The people's champion. Our mission is love. Our vision is love. Jamaicans for justice. The people's champion.
Okay, welcome back to Let's Start Justice. We're just wrapping up with Professor Clayton, but there's some interesting things that you said earlier, Prof, that I just wanted your views on, because two things jumped out at me while you were speaking. The importance of placing children in families, that foster care or the permanent adoption. The challenge that we're seeing in Jamaica, however, is that the adoption process itself is, what's the word I'm looking for, Jade? It's not as ideal as we would want.
Mikhail, it's a nightmare. It is unbelievably dreadful. Yeah. And I speak from personal experience. It is incredibly slow and cumbersome and bureaucratic and time-consuming.
Yeah.
It's not fit for purpose. It really is.
Prof, if we're saying that these things can make a difference,
yes,
why are we then as a society focusing just on the toughen crime approach rather than clearing some of the what you would call it now, the roadblocks that could maybe lend itself to some improvement in the lives of children and serve as a preventative measure? You know, these are the challenges that I'm grappling with. And you were talking about rehabilitation, and that, yes, we understand that the younger the child is, the greater likelihood of us having that success. But the question I have for you, Prof, is the rehabilitation programs that we have now, are they working? Are they sufficient? Are they impactful? Does it have all of the right notes in the ecosystem? You know, when you look at mental health experts, guidance counselors, social workers, what is missing from your standpoint?
Most of the above. Well, we don't have a properly functioning system, and it's partly a resource issue on the face of it. But then when you think about it, you think of all of the spending that we do on social programs in this country. And on average, and I'm now just talking about Jamaican taxpayer dollars, the amount that we throw at social programs is the equivalent of about 40% of the budget for the Ministry of Education, which is one of our big spending ministries. And these programs have been so badly administered that in most cases we cannot see any measurable results. We, Capri, tracked social spending over a 10-year period. All of these social programs and initiatives were supposed to do something about reducing the level of violence in this society. And over the entire period, the level of violence went up, not down. But when they drilled further down and looked at some of these programs, they found that they hadn't been properly monitored or evaluated. There was no baseline study. Nobody had done any proper tracking of what the money was being spent on or evaluated outcomes. We have thrown billions of dollars into completely non-functioning social programs. And this does not include all the money that we've received from international development partners to also spend on social programs, most of which have been equally ineffective, and most of which have collapsed once the funding was withdrawn, which meant that they had no strategy for actually bringing about a permanent structural change in the communities that were supposed to benefit. What we could do is take the money away from any social program that cannot actually demonstrate that it's having an effect, and use that money to support programs that we actually think will work, but track them properly and learn as we go. And you never get it right first time. So you always, you build learning into these programs. Get the children out of the toxic stress environments. We need more people who are properly trained to pick up the signs of distress in children, in schools and in the communities, and have early intervention. Save the family if we can, but if not, the priority really has to be to work with the children to save them. And with the resources that we are currently squandering and throwing away on useless, pointless programs, we would have the resource to do it properly. But as you know, Mikhail and Jay, there's an awful lot of politics about these things. And people are very reluctant to reallocate resources away from their program. But that's what we have to be willing to do. This is a solvable problem, and we have the resources to do it. So the only real impediment to this is politics and people's reluctance to think strategically about what the problem is and how to solve it.
Yes, completely agree, because for us at JFJ, people thought we were being resistant when we said we're not necessarily in support of a new ministry, because it's almost like you're putting another layer of bureaucracy to pay another minister, another permanent secretary, another technical staff, without possibly looking at how the funds are already splintered across the different ministries and agencies, and you don't have that interministerial support or coordination. Because I agree with you, the lack of a strong monitoring, evaluation, and learning framework means that we're doing the same thing over and over and over again without having the inroads and real learning. And the other thing, Prof, that jumped out at me, we have one guidance counselor to 500 students. That ratio is undesirable.
It's hopeless. I mean, seriously, Mikhail, it's hopeless.
Mm-hmm.
If you're to work with just a handful, half a dozen of very disturbed children is enormously time-consuming and emotionally demanding. A caseload of 500 kids is impossible.
Mm-hmm. And they're operating on roster shift system.
Yeah.
Mondays and Tuesdays at this school, Wednesdays and Thursdays at another school.
Yes.
Yeah. Jane?
So we can fix it. We know in principle what to do. We have the resources, but you're up against some entrenched vested interests and inertia.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think you kind of summed it up quite well for for us there. I really appreciate you joining us today. I really appreciate your perspective on balancing our responses. I like that Mikhail actually brought up, like, we're not necessarily saying that you can't implement tougher legislation that is necessary in some of the cases, but where is the focus on those alternative strategies that are going to bring us that long-term reduction that we're hoping to see? And we appreciate you pointing out that the resources are there, because whenever we bring it up as something that we need to be poignantly addressing, we're told that resources are the challenge. So yeah, I thank you so much for joining us, Professor Clayton, and we appreciate your contribution to this.
Thank you so much.
Have a good day.
And you. Bye-bye.
So we were just joined by Professor Anthony Clayton, prime and national security expert, and I'm happy that he clarified a position that I think has often been misrepresented. Because, we've always said that El Salvador, any draconian measure can work. It can. You just lock up people for an extended period of time, and obviously crime will drop. We saw that in 2010 with the Tivoli incursion. The challenge is, what price are we willing to pay as a society? What if you're one of those innocent people that is locked up without due process? And there is a thought in justice, in human rights, that even the one life that has been mistakenly taken away by the state or denied due process is one life too many. And I also ask people, when they're considering these things, are we acting on the premise that when you give the executive branch, your police, the military, the prime minister, the extraordinary powers to make El Salvador work, you're acting on the premise that the prime minister, the police, and so on will then come to you as a citizen and say, you know what, I've done what I wanted to. I'm going to just turn back over these powers and just bring back the Constitution within the principle of democracy. Let's get real. We're going down a slippery slope, and I don't think it's a price that we fully appreciate, much less to say we're willing to pay it. Yeah?
Mikhail, I think that a part of it is that and I've been guilty of this thinking in the past, is that when we think of certain solutions, we consider it outside of ourselves, that, they're implementing this solution to deal with a certain kind of person in our society. And therefore, because I'm not that kind of person, it will never touch me and it will never affect me. And unfortunately, that's simply not true. When you allow your rights to be restricted, unduly restricted, unnecessarily restricted, unjustifiably restricted, they are reduced for everyone. And that will affect you no matter what you think. It will never just affect the actors in society that it is intended to affect. So I think we also have to always keep that in mind.
Mm-hmm. And thanks, Jade. And we're on the same page. Yesterday we wrote an op-ed in the Gleaner, and I saw a letter to the editor that was written by Norman Davis of the Faculty of Law. Yes, that's where Mr. Davis is from.
Norman Manley Law School.
Norman Manley, yes. Just asking the government to reconsider their positions on mandatory minimums. I have some notes here, and I know we're up on the break in a minute. But I want people to think it through. That the first thing, before I even look at what is being proposed, what is already provided for in law, one of them we don't agree with, death penalty. If you commit a capital murder, that is where you kill 2 or more people in a single act, or you kill a member of the judiciary, the police, then you are guilty of a capital offense. And in that regard, the judge can very well impose death penalty once certain things are met, or you can be imprisoned for life. Let's take the break and then I finish the thought.
The people's champion. Our mission is love. Our vision is love. Jamaicans for justice. The people's champion.
Yes, we were just going through what is provided for in law with capital murder already. It's death or life imprisonment. For non-capital murder, that is where someone may be guilty of killing a single person, or, the opposite of capital, for lack of a better terminology.
Yes.
Then you can be imprisoned for life. There are existing periods that you must serve before you become eligible for parole. Currently, for capital murder, you must serve a term of 20 years. For non-capital is 15. And I think for fixed term offenses, fixed term sentences, what, 10 years, Jade?
Yes, 10.
Now, the government is seeking for an adult to increase the period for capital murder from 20 years to non-capital. And by the way, despite what has been said in the Joint Select Committee, there's no possibility for life without parole for an adult. But the government, in essence, by imposing that 50 years, that's what it really is for capital. For non-capital, it's now saying that you must serve what, up to 40 years, I believe, for an adult. And the fixed term is now moving from 10 years for an adult to what, 20 years?
20 years, yes.
Right? For a child now, children ages 12 to under 14, there's a maximum term that they must serve. You can't go over it. That's 25 years. The sticking point becomes for children ages 14 to under 18. Already in law, they can serve a life imprisonment. What this government has complicatedly written, because I tell you, the thing is so complex that it almost begs itself, what exactly are you trying to achieve? There's no saying that a child for non-capital can serve what, Jade? Just remind me.
A child for non-capital murder can serve 30 years with a consideration for parole at 15 years.
And for capital, it's 50 years.
50 years. Yes.
But you must serve at least 20. No, tell me no. You already have poor rehabilitation programs in Jamaica. This is like a government saying that I have given up. There is no judicial discretion for the judge to look at a child based on all of the circumstances that Prof. Clayton had outlined earlier, whether that child was a victim of sexual abuse, the social inquiry report that paints the picture for that child and their own unique circumstances. The judge can't look at that. The legislator, which is overstepping, is now tying the hands of the judge to say that in all issues concerning murder that has been committed for a child, you must impose these sentences. Never mind that a child's brain is not the same as an adult. And if you listen to what Jade said earlier, for fixed sentences, for an adult who commits a crime, the minimum term to be served there is 20 years. And for a child, the minimum term is 15. Not vastly different. Where is justice in that? We're not saying that the judge ought not to issue sentences, where the gravity of the crime says that it is needed. But what we're saying is that the judge must have the flexibility to look at child A, child B, and child C and say, this is what I think. This is what justice means. And I think it's important, Jay, for us to remind the listeners that if it is that the Crown, the prosecutors believe that the judge may have erred and a just sentence was not imposed, they have the right to appeal. So they can go to the Court of Appeal and say, listen to me, I don't think the judge issued a sentence that makes sense.
Yes.
And if you have all of these systems in place, what the government is doing, quite frankly, is politicking. Political expediency. Let me seem tough on crime so they can vote me back in. I make no qualms about it. That's what this has been reduced to. Because there's nothing to suggest based on evidence, based on data, that the judges are acting contrary to the best interest of the child or the best interest of the case that is before the courts. What are we doing? But I hope people will listen up and pay attention.
Because it always shakes me when we have this discussion. I just remember that line from the Joint Select Committee report where the committee asked the Court Administration Division, how many children have committed this offense that we are going out of our way to change our legislation to have these children in custody for all of this time. The total number between, and I don't want to misquote,
2017.
2017 till 2023 at the date then that they were being asked was 47.
Which is roughly 3%. 3%. So, one of the things we have said, and we will continue to call for, and I see Mr. Davis making a similar call, is to insert that safety valve to say, you know what, if you want to do your politicking and seem like you're tough on crime, impose your mandatory minimum. However, have a clause that clearly says that in extraordinary circumstances where the judge believes it's in the best interest of justice to deviate from the mandatory minimum, they have such discretion. That's all we're asking for. So if you
Yes.
want to go down this misadventure, at the very least, have that safety valve to ensure that the pursuit of justice can be so realized.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
The last thing, Jade, we had our launch last week. It would be remiss of me not to big up the team, yourself included, but led by Vanessa Parkinson, our programming
Yes.
officer, Nicholas, and the others who chipped in ensuring that we had a successful launch of our EU project. But there are other partners that would have contributed towards the printing of some books, like our Global Fund grant. So we launched our Know Your Rights for children ages 12 to 17 years. Please come to the office and pick up a copy. It will be ready in another 2 weeks. We just managed to have the EU printed versions at the launch, but we have our other donor partners who are printing some copies. And we relaunched our Know Your Rights for adults. And we also have our constitutional reform submissions in a abridged version that we are going to be using on our town hall meetings that will be held May 9th.
9 is the first
That's
one at the
Thursday,
Serious
by the
Baptist
Ocherious
Church.
Baptist Church, yeah. Jade, you have the others off the top of your head?
Off the top
How
of
many
my
days from the 9th is what? Dear
to
God.
I will say that if you are following our Instagram, these dates should be ingrained in your mind, as there's a
Yeah,
lovely
man.
poster on there.
You're
But we
going,
do
I
have
think Jade is looking for the poster where she make
we
those
have
comments.
May 9th, we have May 16th in Montego Bay at the Civic Center, and then in Kingston on May 31st at Jamaica College Auditorium.
Yeah. No, we also, please stay tuned. They're going to be live OB for the ones in Ocherious and Montego Bay via IRI FM. And
Yes.
the one in Kingston on the 31st will be aired on nationwide. But of course, at Bridge, we're going to be keeping you up to date via the radio show by playing snippets and so on. But we also had the minister, the Honorable Malahu Fort, who was at the event. She gave a keynote address there, and she welcomed the project and the activities that we have within it. And there were other noted speakers, the DCP Clifford Blake, who is the head of iProbe. We had other persons who were not on the agenda. Olga from UNICEF, that's the country representative who, lent her support to the project, and others. I don't want to keep calling names to get myself in trouble. But let me go back to the good minister who spoke. She gave some updates that the bill, the Constitutional Reform Committee, of course, is doing its work, meeting, and a recommendation report is going to be submitted to Cabinet. And thereafter, we're going to be having the bill to replace the monarchy. Now, having said that, JJ, we reiterate our call that that particular bill should be subjected to a joint select committee of Parliament to ensure that the specific areas of what a non-executive president would look like can be so rigorously discussed and debated, and the public will have an opportunity to understand what the reserved powers of the non-executive president would be looking like. Now, that's a call that JFJ has been making in terms of, let's not go the presidential route like what you have in the United States. Let's have a non-executive president with certain reserved powers. Based on what I gleaned from a report that the minister had updated the media on, is that the non-executive president would have certain powers, for example, appointing independent senators, which is aligned with one of the calls that JFJ had made, that at least 2 of the senators can be so appointed by the non-executive president if it is that you don't have enough third political parties amassing certain popular votes during a general election. So, there are certain nuances that, of course, would require some debate. One of the things that, based on the public utterances of the minister, she had indicated that the non-executive president would be so appointed by way of 2 independent sittings, one at the lower house with your 63 members of parliament, one at the upper house where they would vote on that president. That's not in keeping with JFJ's call, because that was a debate that happened in the 1990s. JFJ is saying, let's have one single sitting with both houses of parliament, but extending the local government representatives, which will be your 228 councillors, to be a part of that conversation. I was challenged on this point with Sanjay Lewis during an interview, but we head to our call, because in that regard, you would have more people being a part of the voting process without the non-executive president being directly elected by the people, because that person is a symbol of unity. They need to be above the political fray. You don't want them to be in the political cascas as they're trying to get themselves nominated and elected by the people. So these were some of the things. And the last thing I want to say here, and JD can chip in, the non-executive president, we're saying that person should have an opportunity that when a controversial bill, for example, is being passed, say, for example, extending the tenure of the DPP, that non-executive president can say, hold on there to the Senate. I can't pass this yet, because I think a little thing kind of troubling here. Let me send it back for reconsideration. And if the Senate and the lower house send it back up, you must sign off on it. But there's another little safeguard we're proposing, that if the non-executive president still thinks something is wrong, they can seek the advice of the Supreme Court, which is the constitutional court. So you want that kind of safeguard. You don't want the rubber stamping kind of system that we have here, because you need to ensure that whomever is assenting the laws are assenting laws that are in keeping with the Constitution, because we've seen far too many controversial bills being enacted into law that are quite questionable. And who figure decide to them have legal standing and money figure fine, when you could just have certain safeguards existing before. Yeah?
Absolutely. Absolutely, Mikhail. Have to agree with you.
Interesting days are ahead with constitutional reform, but JFJ. Oh, by the way, a last thing, we still have a minute, so I'm not over time. The recommendation that we see coming from the CRC is that the Electoral Commission will be recommended to be enshrined in the Constitution. It's a recommendation that was there before. If you remember the ECJ, it's an interim act. And the recommendation from the CRC is that, let me speak in part one now, let go this thing about the political ombudsman, and let's just put the ECJ in the Constitution as was provided for. So it's going to be interesting to see whether or not the government adopts that proposal, given that they went on that ill-advised route earlier in subsuming the political ombudsman into the ECJ. So yeah, interesting days. But stay tuned. We're going to be talking more in detail about this at the town hall.
Absolutely. So we'll see you on May 9th in Ocho Rios, and you can tune in on IRA FM.
All right, so that is it for today. Thank you so much for another episode of Let's Talk Justice. My name is Mikhail Jackson.
And I'm Shade Williams.
All right, have a good day.
Jamaicans, for justice, the people's champion. Justice for all, justice under the law, justice, Jamaica demand, right to life, right to liberty. Out of many we are one in a Jamaica, make it a better place for the boys and girls, created equal by the creator, for equal rights and opportunities, no to unlawful detention, and police brutalization, class, gender, race or religion, we not tolerate discrimination.
To join the fight against injustice, contact us at 755-4524 or Jamaicans4Justice.org.
The people's champion.